For many people, the Cold War gets viewed as an ideological struggle between the liberalism of individuality and the authoritarian nature of collectivism, which sounds like a convincing framework until you actually stop to examine the facts. The United States was the land of liberty, of freedom of expression, where all people are created equal. But the reality is that the US was not a land of equality, as evidenced by Jim Crow regulations, gender inequalities, and the persecution of alternate sexualities. But the period of the Cold War was also marked by organized opposition to these inequalities, as American citizens looked to force society to give them the rights to which they were entitled. I'm your host David, and today we are going to look at one of the watershed events of the struggle of the LGBTQ+ community to be accepted as equal partners in America, the Stonewall Riots. This is the Cold War. In the early morning hours of June 28, 1969, police raided a gay bar in Greenwich Village called the Stonewall Inn, which sounds dramatic until you realize that in 1960s America, raiding gay bars was basically municipal routine maintenance. The police raided bars constantly. They checked IDs, arrested employees, dragged people into paddy wagons, threatened to out patrons publicly, and generally reminded queer Americans that their existence was tolerated only in the sense that mold is tolerated in a badly maintained apartment building. You can complain about it, you can try to scrub it out, but mostly the city just learns to live with it while pretending it isn't structural. Normally, raids followed a familiar script. Police entered, people scattered, the bar shut down for a few days, maybe a few weeks. Lives were quietly damaged, everyone absorbed the humiliation, and moved on. But this time, something broke. And what's important about Stonewall is not simply that queer people fought back. After all, queer Americans had resisted police harassment before. There had already been protests, demonstrations, underground organizing, legal campaigns, and earlier uprisings, the Compton's cafeteria riot in San Francisco, for example. What made Stonewall different was the moment in which it happened, because Stonewall was not just a gay rights story, it was a Cold War story. The riot happened at the exact point where decades of political repression, suburban conformity, masculinity, panic, anti-communist paranoia, urban policing, and 60s radicalism all crashed into each other at 2 o'clock in the morning outside a mafia-run gay bar in New York City. And honestly, if you were trying to design the most historically symbolic location possible for the collapse of post-war American social consensus, you could do worse. To understand Stonewall, you first have to understand what the Cold War did to American identity. Because the Cold War was never just about nuclear weapons or the Soviet Union. It was about creating a very specific idea of what an American citizen was supposed to look like. The ideal Cold War American was heterosexual, gender-conforming, domestically stable, patriotic, emotionally disciplined, and preferably living in suburbia next to a lawn that looked aggressively mowed. Men were supposed to be masculine providers. Women were supposed to be feminine homemakers. Families were supposed to produce happy children while consuming enough kitchen appliances to reassure the world that capitalism worked. And all of this was political. Post-war domestic life became propaganda. American politicians and media constantly contrasted the supposedly stable, prosperous nuclear family with the threat of communism. The suburban household became evidence that democracy and capitalism created moral order, which meant anyone who disrupted that image became suspicious. And queer Americans disrupted it simply by existing. During the Cold War, homosexuality increasingly became framed not merely as immoral, but as dangerous. The federal government argued that gay people represented security risks because they could supposedly be blackmailed by foreign powers, which was an extraordinary piece of circular logic. The government criminalized and stigmatized homosexuality, making queer people vulnerable, then used that vulnerability as justification for even more repression. That logic fueled what historians now call the Lavender Scare, the anti-gay counterpart to the Red Scare. Thousands of federal employees lost jobs or security clearances because they were suspected of being homosexual. Careers vanished over gossip, mannerisms, bachelorhood, or simply seeming off to investigators. The Cold War state developed an obsession with ideological conformity and gender conformity at exactly the same time, because in many ways they were treated as the same thing. Deviation itself became suspicious, and that suspicion filtered into every level of American life. Police departments targeted queer gathering spaces. Psychiatrists classified homosexuality as a mental illness. Newspapers publicly outed people after arrests. Anti-cross-dressing laws allowed police to arrest people for failing to wear enough appropriate gendered clothing, which is one of those historical realities that sounds fake until you remember America once tried to solve social anxiety with both McCarthyism and Jell-O molds. You know, Minnesota salads that aren't really salads. The result was a country where queer Americans learned to live under constant surveillance. And yet, despite all of this, queer communities survived, not openly and not safely, but persistently. By the 1950s and 60s, underground queer networks existed in cities across the United States. There were bars, informal social systems, coded language, newsletters, activist groups, and organizations like the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Bilitis. Historians increasingly argued that Stonewall only became possible because decades of quieter organizing had already laid the groundwork for collective resistance. That point matters because Stonewall is often flattened into a mythological beginning, a single explosive moment where history supposedly started. But history almost never works that way. Movements are usually built long before they become visible. And by the late 1960s, the broader political climate in America was changing rapidly. The Vietnam War was becoming disastrous, while faith and trust in government institutions was collapsing. Protest movements were reshaping public life. Civil rights activists, anti-war organizers, feminists, student radicals, and black liberation groups were openly challenging state authority. Queer activists were part of that world too. Historian Ian Lekus argues that LGBTQ+ activists were deeply embedded within the broader political movements of the long 60s, even though queer history is often treated as a footnote to the era rather than one of its central threads. These activists carried lessons with them. They learned organizing strategies from civil rights movements. They absorbed the language of liberation from anti-colonial struggles and anti-war activism. They began increasingly viewing queer oppression not as an isolated issue, but as a part of a larger system of social control. At the same time, many queer activists also experienced homophobia inside supposedly progressive movements. New left organizations frequently treated homosexuality as embarrassing, politically dangerous, or incompatible with revolutionary masculinity. Lekus notes that gay baiting was common, with activists accused of being weak, effeminate, or insufficiently masculine. And this reveals something important about Cold War America. Even movements dedicated to social transformation often reproduced the same anxieties about masculinity and gender conformity that shaped mainstream society. The Cold War had militarized masculinity so thoroughly that political dissent itself could be framed as feminine, weak, or sexually suspect. And this pressure built everywhere at once, inside homes, workplaces, activist circles, and inside bars. You know what? Especially inside bars. And that's because bars like the Stonewall Inn occupied a strange place in Cold War America. They were both exploitative and essential. Since legitimate businesses often refused queer customers, organized crime stepped into the gap. Stonewall itself was mafia-run. Its drinks were famously watered down, and its infrastructure was questionable. Its very legal existence largely depended on bribery and loopholes. But it also provided something increasingly precious: public space. Martin Duberman's reconstruction of the Stonewall Inn captures it less as a polished historic landmark and more as a loud, overcrowded underground ecosystem held together by music, camp, exhaustion, and mutual recognition. There were drag queens swapping gossip and makeup tips. There were hippies, hustlers, homeless queer youth, middle-class gay men, and people drifting between identities and social groups. Fake names were signed into membership books to maintain the fiction that Stonewall was a private club. White lights flashed when police appeared, so patrons would stop dancing together. The cops themselves were referred to with camp nicknames, like Betty Badge and Alice Blue Gown. Reading these accounts, what becomes striking is how much queer nightlife resembled life under occupation. There were codes and signals and lookouts, and even escape routines. An entire social architecture built around surviving police attention. But eventually, people reached a breaking point. On the night of June 28th, police entered the Stonewall Inn expecting another ordinary raid. But witnesses quickly noticed something unusual. Instead of immediately dispersing, crowds began gathering outside the bar. That sounds minor until you understand how much fear shaped queer public life in the 1960s. People were trained to disappear, to avoid attention, because to survive, they needed to be invisible. But this time the crowd stayed, and historians have spent decades trying to explain why. Cynthia Poindexter specifically argues against interpreting Stonewall as merely spontaneous mob behavior. The raid itself was routine, as was the repression. The violence was routine. What changed, though, was the political atmosphere surrounding it. By 1969, years of organizing, radicalization, anti-war activism, police distrust, and generational rebellion had fundamentally altered how many people understood authority itself. So when police attempted to perform yet another familiar ritual of humiliation, the crowd reacted differently. Coins were thrown first, mocking police corruption, then bottles, then bricks and debris. Protesters slashed tires, formed crowds in the street, and eventually forced police to barricade themselves inside the bar. And what stands out in many accounts is not just the anger, but the theatricality of the resistance. Protesters formed kick lines in front of police officers. Over multiple nights, hundreds of members of New York's queer community took to the streets around the Stonewall Inn, battling with police, refusing to back down. They mocked authority openly and publicly, and that mattered. Shame had long been one of the state's primary weapons against queer Americans, but Stonewall disrupted that emotional order. The riot transformed public humiliation into collective defiance, and from that moment, queer politics changed dramatically. The Gay Liberation Front emerged almost immediately after the riots, and even the name reflected the influence of global liberation politics. The organization intentionally borrowed its title from the National Liberation Front in Vietnam. That's the organization more commonly referred to as the Viet Cong, by the way. So clearly, not subtle. Gay liberation activists increasingly connected queer oppression to militarism, racism, sexism, and state violence. Earlier homophile organizations had often pursued cautious assimilation, trying to prove that homosexuals were respectable citizens, deserving tolerance. But the post-Stonewall generation was less interested in asking permission. And conservatives reacted exactly the way you would expect people to react when a society built on rigid definitions of normality suddenly starts losing control over those definitions. Because think about it, Stonewall represented more than queer visibility. It represented the collapse of Cold War certainty. The post-war consensus that had defined American identity through rigid gender roles, suburban domesticity, patriotic conformity, and carefully managed respectability was already weakening under the pressure of Vietnam, civil rights struggles, feminism, and generational rebellion. And Stonewall became part of that unraveling. That is why the riot still matters politically today. Not because it created queer resistance out of thin air, but because it exposed one of the central contradictions of Cold War America. The United States spent decades presenting itself as the global defender of freedom, while aggressively policing who was allowed to exist freely inside its own borders. Stonewall forced that contradiction into public view. It didn't do it politely, it didn't do it quietly, and it had no intention of doing it gradually. It did it through open rebellion against a system that had spent decades insisting conformity was the price of citizenship. The Cold War built an America obsessed with normality, but Stonewall was what happened when the people excluded from that definition stopped agreeing to disappear. We hope you've enjoyed this episode, and to make sure you don't miss our future work, please make sure you're subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button, which is wishing you all a happy Pride. Please consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/thecoldwar or through YouTube membership. We can be reached via email at thecoldwarchannel@gmail.com. This is The Cold War Channel, and as we think about the Cold War, please remember that history is shades of gray and rarely black and white.